So in this video, we'll be taking a look at a transgender YouTuber named Samantha Lux. In case you're not familiar with who that is, she's a transgender YouTuber, so she was born as a male but transitioned to female. And in this video, she's criticizing an advertisement from the Alliance Defending Freedom because she feels that the advertisement is transphobic or makes transphobic arguments. The reason I'm responding to this video in particular is because in this video she makes a lot of arguments in favor of things like the Equality Act and other expansions of government power over individual liberty to freely associate and practice religion. Now before I begin, a quick disclaimer to anyone in my comment section with an IQ less than 5 who wants to go and say, "You're attacking a transgender person?" No, I'm not. I'm attacking this person's arguments. I don't care that this person is transgender. Them being transgender is their business. I would be criticizing these exact same arguments if they were being made by a cisgender person. So to any social justice retards in my comment section, don't even start with that shit.
Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Another day, another transphobic ad going around on YouTube.
And of course by transphobic she probably means it makes arguments she doesn't like.
For some reason they always advertise on my channel. Like, sweetie, wrong demographic.
Actually, it's the perfect demographic. The whole point of making an argument is to try and get people on your side. So of course they're going to be directed toward people who are more likely to disagree. I mean, what's the point of trying to convince people if they already agree with you?
A lot of you have been messaging me and saying, oh my god, have you seen this new transphobic ad? I just saw it on your channel before one of your videos.
I've actually watched the video she's referring to and it's really not all that transphobic. As a matter of fact, most of the arguments it makes are basically common sense.
In today's video, I'm going to be reacting to a video titled, How Modern Equality Comes at Women's Expense.
And I really do like how they decide to put the word equality in quotes in the video title, because I think that really highlights what's fundamentally at issue here. And that is we have an agenda which has nothing to do with equality being sold to us on the basis of equality. And we'll go into more detail on what I mean by that later in the video.
It's from a YouTube channel called Alliance Defending Freedom.
So in case you're not familiar with what the Alliance Defending Freedom is, they're basically a right-wing conservative religious think tank. The organization tends to be considered controversial, especially in LGBT circles, and this primarily has to do with the stance they usually take on LGBT issues. And while I'm not a fan of their more extreme viewpoints, I generally agree with the arguments they make regarding religious liberty and the power of the government to compel servitude.
And as we're about to learn today, they're not actually about defending freedom, they're about defending their right to discriminate against people that they don't like.
So she seems to be arguing as if being in favor of freedom and the right to discriminate are somehow mutually exclusive. Like being in favor of one logically entails not being in favor of the other. But the right to not associate with people you don't like is in fact part of freedom.
So I am not a fan, to say the least.
Not a fan of what? Free association? We'll touch on this more later in the video, but I have a feeling that Samantha is probably a fan of the fact that she can't be compelled to associate with transphobic people or people who are against trans people.
So like I said, this is the video that we're going to be reacting to today. It's titled, How Modern Equality Comes at Women's Expense.
So as the thumbnail of the video implies, it looks like we will be discussing the Equality Act. The Equality Act is something I've touched on in previous videos but never really went in depth with. But basically what it is an attempt to take a very left-wing conception of gender and instead of having it compete openly in a free marketplace of ideas, have the government shove it down everybody's throat against their consent, all under the guise of anti-discrimination legislation.
So I don't know if I've reacted to a video from this channel before, but I've reacted to similar type channels before, you know, just like the most transphobic, conservative, right-wing, anti-women's rights, all that kind of stuff channel you could find.
So we have like a whole hodgepodge of straw man and poisoning the well going on here. First of all, she seems to be conflating transphobia with right-wing conservatives, which, I mean, I'm a right conservative-leaning person and I don't have a problem with transgender people. Heck, a friend of mine I've known for years recently went through an FTM transition. She seems to also conflate all these ideas and concepts with being against women's rights, which on its face is kind of absurd because a lot of the arguments made in the video that she's responding to are predicated upon women's rights.
Should a school-aged girl or a grown woman be forced to give up her privacy in a locker room because a biological man identifying as a woman wants to change there?
According to the left, yes. I actually talked about a recent example of this happening in one of my videos. At a spa in Los Angeles, a biological male with male genitalia insisted that they be allowed to use the women's section because they consider themselves a woman, and the left defended it.
Should a shelter serving women who have survived rape, sex trafficking, and domestic violence be forced to allow biological men to sleep side by side with these women?
Oh god, you could just imagine how that would turn out. Imagine that a woman gets beaten or raped severely by her husband, and then checks into a women's shelter to stay safe. And unbeknownst to her, her husband can still access that space by simply claiming he identifies as a woman. And the most fucked up part about this is that the left would defend that. There's no safety or privacy that's too sacred for their agenda.
They got more claims. I'm just gonna stop it already because, like, I got things to say. Okay, Alliance Defending Freedom, I have things to say. First of all, the terminology is so obviously trying to frame these questions in a way that makes you think it's like an obvious answer. Like, of course we shouldn't have men in women's locker rooms. Like, of course not. But if you're familiar with the actual debates, you would know that when they say biological men or even just men, they're actually referring to transgender women or transgender girls even, because we're talking about high school sport.
I can't speak on behalf of anyone else, but for me personally, when I refer to biological men, I'm referring to people who are biologically male. So people who have male biology, male anatomy. If you have a penis and testicles and male hormones, then as far as I'm concerned, you're male. Now, if a person who is born male alters their biology so that they become female, so they get surgery to change their genitals, and they get the hormone treatment to convert their hormones to the other gender, then at that point I would consider them to be a transgender man or woman or whatever. So the terms transgender woman and biological male are not synonymous. A biological male is a person with male biology, and a transgender woman is a person who is biologically male at birth but transitions their biology to become female.
So far for these first two questions, and honestly throughout the whole entire video, they're really playing off the assumption that all trans women are predators and all trans women are a threat to cisgender women.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
When in reality, we all know that's not the case. There is literally no data that shows that trans women are a threat.
So the argument isn't necessarily that transgender women pose a threat to cisgender women. The argument is that when you decide to allow men to access women's spaces for simply just declaring themselves a woman, so they don't have to actually transition or anything, that raises the possibility that someone could access the facilities of the opposite gender for nefarious purposes. Suppose that you have some sort of creepy dude who wants to peep on girls in their bra and panties. Well, now all they have to do is declare themselves a woman, and boom, they get access to the women's changing room.
However, there is data that actually shows that trans women are often the targets of harassment, often the targets of sexual abuse and assault.
Red herring.
This is a bit of a tangent. I mean, yeah, if transgender people are being assaulted or harassed, then obviously I'm against that. I don't think anyone should be assaulted or harassed, transgender or cisgender, but the issue being brought up in the video doesn't really have anything to do with transgender people being attacked or harassed or anything like that. The issue being addressed here is, should biological men, so that is people who are born male and never transition, be allowed to access spaces designated so that women can have privacy simply because they declare themselves a woman?
There have been numerous cases of trans women literally dying after being refused shelter at a women's shelter.
Again, if we're talking about an actual transgender woman, so someone who actually transitioned to being female, then yeah, obviously I think they should have the same access to services intended to protect women as people who are born as women. But if you're a biological dude with a dick and balls trying to get access to these women's protected areas, then you need to piss off. Those areas are set up and designated so that women can have access to the privacy and protection that they need. If men feel that their safety is at risk and they're in need of protection, there's other services out there for them, but those women's shelters are not your space.
And transgender people actually have the highest risk of being sexually assaulted throughout the entire homeless population.
So according to the data that she's citing, if you're a homeless transgender person, your risk of being sexually assaulted is about 12%. Which really isn't that high. I mean, it's not good, I mean, any percentage above zero in that regard would not be good. But on the list of risks that homeless people face is probably not high on the priorities. I mean, if you think about it, homeless people are at greater risk of all sorts of stuff, just by virtue of being homeless. If someone is homeless, then chances are there's higher priorities on their mind, like how am I going to get a roof over my head, where's my next meal coming from, what am I going to do about my family. The 12% risk that they might get sexually assaulted if they're transgender probably isn't going to be the number one thing they're worrying about. But again, this is a deviation from the issue at hand. If you want to make the argument that homeless shelters should do more to prevent issues like this from happening, then alright, I agree. But let's get back to the issue at hand. Should men be allowed to access women's private spaces simply by declaring themselves women?
Trans students also have a much higher risk of being sexually assaulted or sexually harassed in schools than their cisgender peers.
Have you guys noticed that whenever she cites sources of data, they're never about transgender people as a whole, but rather focus on specific groups, like transgender homeless or transgender students? Groups like students and the homeless have historically been at greater risk for things like harassment and bullying, whether they're cisgender or transgender. I'm very much getting the impression that there's some cherry picking going on here.
A study titled Injustice at Every Turn, a report of the National Transgender Discrimination Survey, found that 12% of transgender youth report being sexually assaulted in K-12 settings by peers or educational staff.
I'm big time raising eyebrows on this claim here, since the data refers to K-12 youth, and in most places you have to be at least 18 or older in order to go through any sort of gender reaffirming procedures. But this also kind of reveals a problem with the sources that she's using. There's a bit of ambiguity here with their use of the term transgender. They don't specify whether they're referring to people who medically transition or just anyone who experiences gender dysphoria, because the term transgender has been used interchangeably to refer to both. So there's some ambiguity here with regards to what specific group the data is in regards to.
And 22% of homeless transgender individuals were assaulted while staying in shelters.
Have you guys noticed how there's some inconsistency here with the data that she's using? In the last article she cited, the claim was that 12% of transgender homeless people were being assaulted. In the article that she's citing now, that jumps to 22%. The two articles that she cited were published around the same time, so it's highly unlikely that the percentage of transgender homeless people being assaulted just magically jumped by 10%. And you know what? If Samantha wants to make the argument that schools and homeless shelters should do more to protect transgender people, then alright, fine, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. But again, that doesn't really have anything to do with the point being argued in the video.
So in my opinion, this whole transphobic illusion of a lack of privacy is not as important as protecting people that are actually being victimized in these places.
So she seems to be arguing as if maintaining privacy and protecting people who are victimized are somehow mutually exclusive, like doing one somehow necessarily negates doing the other. But the reality of it is that oftentimes maintaining privacy is an important way to protect people who've been victimized. Refer to my earlier point about the women's shelters.
Should faith-based adoption providers be shut down for following their conviction that the best environment for each child includes a mother and a father in a committed and stable marriage?
Let me just translate this real quick. What should we call them? I need like a name to say them. ADF? Can we just say ADF? ADF, do you mean to ask, should agencies that discriminate against gay people face consequences for discrimination? Because the answer to that is yes.
So the issue isn't necessarily whether or not these organizations should face consequences for the decisions that they make. Obviously, in a free market, businesses would be facing the consequences of their decisions. So if a business decides they're going to discriminate against a certain group of people and they lose money because of that, well, that's their own fault. The issue is, should the government be able to use force and coercion to make an organization act against their beliefs?
Like, I'm so sorry, your religious conviction that gay parents aren't as suited for parenthood as straight parents, like, it just doesn't matter to me because that's not what the science says. Sorry. The bottom line is that science shows that children raised by two same-gender parents do as well on average as children raised by two different gender parents. So I don't care. You're just wrong.
So generally I do agree with this. There isn't any data out there anywhere to suggest that children raised by same-sex couples are any less off than children raised by heterosexual couples. And of course, as a libertarian, I believe that what two consenting adults do is their business. So if a gay couple wants to adopt and raise a child, that's their business. But as a libertarian, I'm also against using coercion to force people to act against their beliefs. So if an adoption agency decides that a particular couple isn't fit to raise that child, even if it's for a reason that may not be scientifically sound, they're still not obligated to let that couple adopt a child.
I think that if agencies discriminate against gay people, they should face consequences. Like, that, the answer is yes.
If by consequences you mean that organization should lose money and get bad PR, then alright, I agree. What I'm against is if you think the government should use force to compel that organization to act against their beliefs.
Should a biological male who believes he is female be allowed to compete against women and girls in female sports, depriving female athletes of a level playing field and countless opportunities to win and even earn college scholarships?
I am not even gonna talk about this right now. I have so many videos on the reality of being a trans athlete and what they actually have to go through and whether or not it's fair or unfair. So I'm just gonna link those videos down below, okay? Just check those out. I don't have the time to go into it again. I mean, I do have the time, but I just truly do not feel like it. Like, they're not gonna listen anyway.
So the issue of transgender people participating in athletic activities is a bit complex. It involves a lot of different complicated factors, such as human physiology, the difference between the genders, the effect that transitioning has on athletic performance, whether it's more important that sports are inclusive or balanced. There's a lot of different facets to this issue, and that's an iceberg I'd rather save for a different video.
Despite its appealing name, the Equality Act poses an unprecedented threat to women, children, free speech, and religious freedom.
Oh boy, here we go. We're going to talk about the Equality Act. I figured it was going to come up at some point in this video. It was only a matter of time.
At its core, the Act ignores what science tells us about the differences between men and women, leaving women and girls to pay the price in shelters, locker rooms, and on the field of play.
Here's the thing. It literally doesn't. Like, what science are you referring to? The science is not on your side. The vast majority of science, if not all science, validates a trans identity and supports non-discrimination laws like the Equality Act.
Wait, how can science support non-discrimination laws? How can science support laws, like, in general? Like, science gives us facts about nature, and laws are a construct of man, of society. More specifically, they're a construction of the state imposed on you without your consent using the threat of violence. But getting back to the point, science is simply facts about nature. It doesn't tell us what the most rational course of action would be. That's for people to figure out on their own. The issue of whether or not private businesses should be allowed to discriminate is an issue of ethics and philosophy, not science.
Like, just say you're transphobic and move on.
So are those the only two possibilities? Either you're against the Equality Act because of science or because you're transphobic? Because here's the thing, I'm not transphobic, but I'm still against the Equality Act. As a matter of fact, and for reasons I'll get into later in the video, it's possible that someone can be 100% in favor of trans rights, but still be against the Equality Act.
Don't try to make it about science because you're just wrong. Like, you're just incorrect. And if you want to bring science into it, like, cite some sources, babe.
You don't really need to cite any sources to be against anti-discrimination laws, because as I've mentioned earlier, the issue of whether or not people have the right to discriminate is an ethical and philosophical issue, not a scientific one. But also, and more importantly, I'd like to know what sources you're getting your scientific information from, Samantha, because I am rather curious to know what scientific papers there are out there that are arguing that a person with a penis magically becomes a woman if they say so.
In short, the Equality Act doesn't offer equality. It creates victims. How would the Equality Act do this? By adding gender identity and sexual orientation to federal laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the act seeks to impose the government's views about marriage, sex, and what it means to be male and female on the entire nation.
They're like, it's creating victims by forcing you to understand and accept trans and gay people and all this stuff. First of all, no, it doesn't. It doesn't force or impose anything on anybody. The only thing that these laws are saying is that you can't discriminate against people because they're gay or because they're trans.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
So these laws somehow simultaneously compel people to associate with people they don't want to against their will, and don't force or impose anything on anyone. Yeah, not quite following the logic there.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a non-discrimination law. You know that, right? They're really out here trying to be like, no, I should be allowed to discriminate against the transgenders. That's my right.
Well, Samantha, you might not like hearing this, but it really is. People have a right to free association. People have a right to decide whom they do and don't want to associate with. Nobody is obligated to associate with someone they don't want to. And if you insist that someone be forced to associate with you against their will, well then that's slavery.
Imagine being this mad. Imagine making this whole video and like advertising it across YouTube, complaining that they're broadening the Civil Rights Act, that they're including more people in the Civil Rights Act. That's embarrassing.
The Civil Rights Act is a very specific law with a very specific scope, intended to address a very specific problem. I think it's perfectly valid to criticize trying to arbitrarily expand something beyond its original intention. And this is something else the left usually doesn't understand about the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act, when it was first being conceived of, wasn't primarily directed at the private sector. Private sector discrimination wasn't even addressed until Title VII. It was far from the first priority. The primary intention of the Civil Rights Act was to address Jim Crow laws, as in state-mandated segregation. While a handful of businesses in the South were being racist of their own accord, a majority of them were segregating in compliance with state mandates. And the primary intention of the Civil Rights Act was to do away with these government mandates that forced businesses to segregate. And this is why I feel that LGBT people aren't really within the scope of the Civil Rights Act. Like I said, it was a very specific law meant to deal with a very specific problem. State governments were implementing laws that forced private businesses to segregate against black people. And to my knowledge at least, there aren't any laws on the books that force businesses to segregate against gay people. So it's just a completely different scope.
For starters, the Equality Act would mandate that men who identify as women be allowed to compete for spots on female sports teams, for women's scholarships, and for other academic and sports-related opportunities designed specifically for women.
This video is really trying to make it seem like trans people are these villainous people just out there to hurt women and take away women's opportunities.
So again, like I mentioned earlier, the argument isn't necessarily that transgender people are intentionally trying to go out of their way to harm cisgender women. The argument is primarily that this alternative theory of gender that the left wants to push onto everyone, a person with a penis, testicles, and testosterone can just declare themselves a woman at any time, opens the door for people with nefarious intentions to take advantage of. Suppose, for example, that you have a biological male who really wants to exceed at sports, but doesn't feel like putting in the effort to train or practice. So, in a world controlled by the far left, a gorilla-sized dude full of testosterone who declares themselves to be a woman could sign up to compete in a women's sports tournament and just dominate the competition, which would in fact have an adverse effect on the biological women competing in that competition. You know, they all spent Lord knows how long practicing and training to improve their skills, all for some dude who barely did shit to snag their trophies and scholarships. Now, in all fairness, scenarios like this are probably not what Samantha has in mind, but it's a potential consequence of moving things in the direction she's advocating for.
Trans girls just want to play the sport that they love, just like their cisgender peers.
Nobody's arguing that transgender people shouldn't be allowed to play sports. What we're saying is that if they're going to play sports, they need to play in the division that corresponds to their biological gender. You may very firmly believe, in your heart of hearts, deep down, that you are really a woman, and you may desire more than anything else in the world for people to consider you a woman. But if you have two testosterone factories hanging between your legs, then you have an advantage over girls. And until you get that surgically changed, you're going to need to play on the boys' team to keep things fair.
Also, the data shows that allowing them to do so has no negative impacts. Actually, it only has positive impacts. This quote from the ACLU says, "In reality, trans women and girls have been competing in women's sports at all levels around the world. Despite the hundreds, if not thousands, of trans women competing, only a handful have had any success at the high school and collegiate level." Period. Like, I don't even know what else to say.
I have no problem letting trans women play on the women's team, as long as they are actual trans women, if they've actually gone through the process to become biologically female. If you're a biological male with dick, balls, and testosterone trying to get onto the women's team so that you can score some easy victories, you can piss off.
Women competing against similarly gifted and trained males know the outcome of the race before it even starts.
That has to be a really demoralizing feeling. Like, I've actually talked to some female athletes who live in woke left-wing cities where biological men just get to compete on the women's team if they say they're women. They tell me they feel like no matter how hard they work, no matter how hard they train or practice, they'll never be able to win. It's like the most demoralizing feeling in the world. A lot of them have even given up sports altogether because of it, because, why even bother?
In 1 year, 275 high school boys ran faster times than the lifetime best of world champion sprinter Allison Felix.
The amount of data out there that suggests that men do in fact have an advantage over women in sports is just astronomical. Like, it's not even open for debate at this point.
We're not talking about boys here, we're talking about trans girls, who typically, as prescribed by the NCAA, have to undergo at least a year of hormone treatment, including testosterone suppression, before they're even allowed to compete. Multiple studies have shown that when trans women undergo hormone replacement therapy, especially after a year, their athletic abilities are right around the same level as their cisgender female counterparts. Again, I'll link the video down below.
So again, I'm sure there are ways to include transgender women in sports in ways that are fair to cisgender players as well. But you see, as it stands right now, the NCAA and other sports organizations are currently allowed to set their own policy regarding their inclusion of transgender people. What the Equality Act would basically do, if it passed, would strip these organizations of the power to make that decision for themselves and centralize it in the government. And that, I think, is the biggest problem with the Equality Act. Not that it attempts to make things more fair for transgender people, but that it attempts to do so by centralizing power. As I've mentioned previously, the issue of the inclusion of transgender people into not just sports, but probably any number of things, where differences between the sexes are relevant, is a very complex, multi-factored issue, and there's any number of ways you could go about addressing it. Now, in a free market where firms are free to set their own policy, people are free to innovate, come up with their own solutions, try different things, see what works and what doesn't. The problem with the Equality Act, and it's a similar problem that a lot of government regulation has, is that it's a one-size-fits-all solution. It's the government pushing one particular solution onto everybody and basically taking away the right of individuals to try different solutions for themselves. As a result of this, people aren't free to innovate and figure out what works best for them. They have this one-size-fits-all solution sort of thrust upon them that may or may not work in their situation. A solution that might work well in one situation may not necessarily work well in another. And this is why I feel that even if you're someone who 100% supports trans rights, you can still be against the Equality Act, at least for this reason alone, because it sort of robs people of the ability to navigate the issue of transgender inclusion for themselves.
The Equality Act also poses a major threat to the very existence of religious organizations like schools, charities, and even churches. For many Americans, their faith inspires them to act for the good of their neighbors and for the flourishing of society. Their faith also requires them to abide by its teachings regarding marriage, sex, and what it means to be male and female. But the Equality Act directly threatens the ability of religious organizations to serve others according to the beliefs that inspire them.
Listen, I'm not a religious person, but there are thousands of LGBT people who are religious, as well as countless religious organizations that support LGBT people because that's what they believe their religion says to do. So for this video to come out and say, well, their religion says that they have to hate trans people and they have to hate gay people, it's just not true.
I feel like she just kind of defeated her own argument here by pointing out that there's tons of churches and religious organizations that don't discriminate against LGBT people. I guess religious organizations discriminating against LGBT people isn't that big of a problem after all, which means there isn't really a need for legislation like the Equality Act.
A few years ago when I worked in the Yes on 3 campaign to fight against those proposed bills that would allow discrimination against transgender people.
So yeah, Samantha was fighting for the power of government to control people's rights to decide who to freely associate with. Not surprising, since I've noticed a lot of people in the transgender community tend to be politically liberal. Like, not even the LGBT community as a whole, because I know quite a few gay people who consider themselves conservative or libertarian. It seems like transgender people specifically are all sort of in that left-wing big government crowd. Do you guys know of any trans people who are conservative or libertarian? I don't know, maybe you're a trans person who's conservative or libertarian watching this. Let me know in the comments.
Churches consistently allowed us to organize there and use their spaces to promote our cause.
So not only were these religious organizations willing to host you supporting your cause, but they are also basically willing to cuck themselves to people who want to expand government control over them. Yeah, if that's not evidence that gay people aren't at any sort of risk of being oppressed by religious organizations, then I don't know what is.
So I'm so sorry, but I honestly do not have any sympathy for people that try to use their religion as a way to discriminate against trans people or a way to discriminate against gay people. There are so many people who are religious who follow the same religion as you that understand that you don't need to discriminate to be a religious person.
So I'm not really a religious person, I'm not an expert in religion. However, having grown up in a Catholic family, I do know quite a bit about the Bible. And there's two main parts of the Bible that are cited as a justification for being anti-gay. The first is Leviticus 20:13, which says thou shalt not sleep with a man as one would with a woman, and the book of Sodom, in which God caused all these lightning and fires and all this crazy stuff to happen in the village of Sodom, supposedly as a punishment for engaging in homosexual behavior. That's where the word sodomy comes from to describe homosexual sexual activity. Now, it is important to keep in mind that the Bible was written thousands of years ago, and it's been rewritten, retranslated, reinterpreted multiple times throughout history, so the exact meaning behind any biblical passage is going to be very open to interpretation.
This law would not make it possible to be religious. Like, no, it's not. It's just saying you can't discriminate. Like, if your religion is dependent on discrimination, ugh. That's all I'll say is ugh.
So I'm personally not particularly a fan of people using religion as a justification to discriminate against people or religious views that involve discrimination. However, I do believe that people have the right to believe in and exercise whatever religious views they want, and exercise those religious views any way they want so long as they're not violating anyone else's rights. So if there's a church somewhere out there that decides it's part of their religious purview to exclude certain minority groups, even though I personally would disagree with that and choose not to support it, it's still their right.
The act would force faith-based adoption providers, for example, to violate their core beliefs by placing children in homes without a mother and a father.
That imagery? The imagery is literally trying to make it seem like this Equality Act is going to be taking away supportive families from children who need them, and they're just going to be all alone.
So I will agree with Samantha here. This is kind of a bad argument. Allowing same-sex couples to adopt children doesn't logically entail removing children from loving families.
When in reality, that's what organizations who oppose the Equality Act are trying to do. ADF and the people who oppose the Equality Act and oppose allowing gay parents to adopt are the exact people advocating for rejecting potential loving and supportive parents from adopting a kid because they believe that being gay or being trans is wrong. They would rather kids be left in orphanages than be adopted by loving parents who happen to be gay.
So it appears as if she's conflating people who oppose the Equality Act and people who oppose allowing same-sex couples to adopt children. These groups aren't necessarily the same thing. For example, I oppose the Equality Act because it's an expansion of government power over individual freedom of choice. But I'm also perfectly fine with gay couples being allowed to adopt children. Like I said before, what two consenting adults do is their business, and there's no data anywhere to suggest that children raised by same-sex couples are necessarily worse off than children raised by heterosexual couples. I think that anyone who can demonstrate that they're competent to raise a child and that they're capable of providing it a quality home should be allowed to adopt. Whether they're a straight couple, a gay couple, a single parent, doesn't matter. But see, here's the thing, Samantha. Not having the Equality Act in place doesn't necessarily mean that gay couples are prohibited from adopting. Gay couples are still allowed to adopt children without the Equality Act. Not having the Equality Act in place only means that they can't force any particular adoption agency to let them adopt a child if that agency feels that they're unfit parents.
Worse, the act could forbid nearly every religious school, charity, and church from hiring staff and leaders that share their religious views, if those views diverge from the new government orthodoxy.
AKA, the act might not allow religious institutions to hire teachers or staff who are discriminatory or who say that they will not support or accept an LGBT student's identity.
So this is an example of that sort of central planning mentality that you get with a lot of authoritarian ideologies. I know how to run your business or your organization better than you do. I know what viewpoints all of your staff should be sympathetic with. Therefore, I should have the right to decide who you get to hire. Yeah, it's their business, it's their organization, it's their money. They can hire whoever the fuck they want.
Good. Fire them. Get rid of them. I don't care.
So people should be forcibly removed from their jobs, their careers, their livelihoods, their sources of income because they hold political viewpoints you disagree with? Yeah, that's not authoritarian or totalitarian at all.
The act's devastating effects also extend to the marketplace. Just ask creative professionals like Jack Phillips or Baronel Stutzman.
I figured the Jack Phillips case was going to come up in this video sooner or later, and like a lot of left-wingers, I imagine Samantha's probably not going to actually understand what the case is about. We'll get into it though.
Both serve everyone, but cannot express all messages or participate in every event through their art.
Now, this is very important to point out, because as I've mentioned in previous videos, the Jack Phillips case wasn't necessarily about discrimination against homosexuals, as people seem to think. You see, this needs reiterating, but Phillips never said he was refusing to serve the couple because they're gay. He made it clear that he was perfectly willing to sell the couple any other product that the bakery offers. As someone who doesn't believe in same-sex marriage, he doesn't feel comfortable making cakes for same-sex weddings. So he was exercising his First Amendment right to not participate in a ceremony he doesn't believe in.
And when they politely declined to create art celebrating same-sex wedding ceremonies, their home states of Colorado and Washington hounded them with years of litigation under laws similar to the Equality Act.
As they should.
Yeah, we should totally clog up the court system and waste taxpayer dollars over an issue that can simply be remedied by going to a different bakery. And how do you know that in a lot of these cases, these couples aren't intentionally going to bakeries that they know will refuse to make them their cake, just so that they can stir up some publicity or get some easy money out of a lawsuit? Imagine no one wanting to be a baker anymore out of fear of being sued for their political views.
The Equality Act could multiply situations like these, imposing a nationwide version of the freedom-crushing state laws that harm people like Jack and Baronel.
Again, like good. Places of business should not be allowed to discriminate against people because they're gay or because they're trans.
Why not? It's their business, it's their property, it's their equipment, it's their time and labor. Why shouldn't they have the right to decide who to provide it for? So, Samantha, let's say that I decide, because of a particular class I'm a member of, I have the right to go to your house, sleep in your bed, eat food out of your refrigerator, drive your car, wear your clothes. Because of some class I'm a member of, I declare that I have the right to use your property against your consent. How would you feel about that?
The Jack Phillips case and the Baronel Stutzman, I think that's her name, case, they both broke the law. Like, sorry, babe. You broke the law. They clearly discriminated against these people because of their sexuality. Jack Phillips, the cake guy, whatever.
I've already mentioned this earlier, but Jack Phillips didn't really discriminate against them because they're gay. He never said, I'm refusing to serve you because you're gay. He simply decided that at his place of business, he doesn't make cakes for same-sex weddings. And since it's his property, his business, his ingredients, his time and labor, he is 100% within his rights to implement such a policy. And if you disagree with it, you are free to go to a different bakery.
He's from Colorado, broke the Colorado non-discrimination law. It says right here, the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act makes it unlawful for a place of public accommodation to deny the full and equal enjoyment of goods and services to individuals based on certain characteristics, including sexual orientation.
I hate to break it to you, Samantha, but the Supreme Court actually disagrees with you on this one. They voted overwhelmingly to overturn a lawsuit against Jack Phillips. And there's two primary reasons for this. The first reason is the First Amendment issue I brought up earlier, the right for someone to not be forced to create art which depicts a message they disagree with. But they also found that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission was enforcing these laws inconsistently. For example, the Colorado Civil Rights Commission upheld the right of certain bakeries to reject cakes with homophobic messages on them. That's kind of weird. I mean, if it's legitimate to force someone to make a cake with pro-gay messages on it, then surely it's equally as legitimate to force someone to make a cake with anti-gay messages on it.
Baronel Stutzman's from Washington. She also broke Washington's law. The court found that Arlene's Flowers violated Washington's Consumer Protection Act and the Washington Law Against Discrimination by refusing to serve a same-sex couple seeking to buy wedding flowers in 2013. She broke the law.
So you do know that laws are just words on paper written by politicians. They're not necessarily the same thing as what's moral or what's right or wrong. This is something that statists will commonly do. They'll equate breaking the law with actually doing something wrong. I mean, Anne Frank was breaking the law when she was hiding from the Nazis. The law in Germany said if you were Jewish, you had to go to a concentration camp, and she said, nope, I'm going to hide in my attic. Was she doing something wrong? You can't just mention that somebody broke a law, assume that means what they did was wrong, and just leave it at that. You need to actually explain why the law they're accused of breaking is justified.
These freedom-crushing state laws that this ADF is referring to is anti-discrimination laws. You don't have the freedom to discriminate. I'm so sorry.
Actually, you 100% have the freedom to discriminate, because the freedom to discriminate is essentially the freedom from being a slave. Samantha seems to be arguing that Jack Phillips doesn't have the right to refuse to make the cake, but what's the alternative? Jack Phillips being forced against his will to make the cake? He's obligated to use his time and labor to produce something he doesn't want to against his will for you? Are you entitled to that man's time and labor? Do you have the right to just demand labor from other people against their will? Anti-discrimination laws are slavery. It's compelled servitude. That's literally what it is.
Who wrote this? Are you not embarrassed?
The Equality Act imposes a belief system about marriage and human sexuality on everyone and treats reasonable people who disagree with the government's views based on decent and honorable grounds as hostile and unfit to participate in the marketplace. Our nation can and must do better.
The Equality Act does not impose any beliefs. Like, it just doesn't. If you want to believe that gay people are sinners, or you want to believe that trans women are men, you're wrong, first of all, but good for you. You do you. You can believe those things all you want, but you cannot discriminate because you believe those things.
So people are allowed to hold viewpoints you disagree with so long as they're also forced to parrot viewpoints you do agree with? What's the point of having the freedom to believe whatever you want if you're not allowed to exercise those beliefs?
You cannot discriminate against people because they're gay. You cannot discriminate against trans people because they're trans. It's pretty simple.
So what, you're not going to explain why that is? You're just going to make the claim that people shouldn't be free to decide for themselves whom they want to associate with and on what basis? And not provide any sort of explanation to back up that argument other than, quote, it's pretty simple? This is more or less the same problem we ran into in that one Progressive Voice video. He made the argument multiple times that bakers shouldn't be allowed to discriminate against gay people, but never really provided an explanation as to why. I mean, at least Kyle Kulinski actually gave some sort of an explanation, some sort of a rationale to justify his arguments.
Alliance Defending Freedom, I think that you should maybe rename yourself Alliance Defending Discrimination, because like that's what we're talking about, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, discrimination is freedom. You have the right to decide who you do and don't associate with. The alternative is forced association, which is literally slavery.
And honestly, you probably find your target audience a bit better, because let's look at the like to dislike ratio. 5.1 thousand dislikes to 500 likes. You got a 10% approval rating on this video, sis.
Yeah, like and dislike numbers don't really mean anything. Like, if you're criticizing something with a really devout fan base, that video is going to get ratioed, no matter how good the arguments in the video actually are.
Okay, that is the end of that video. Thank God. 5 minutes was plenty enough. In conclusion, if you want to be a bigot, if you want to be transphobic, homophobic, any of that kind of stuff, you do you. But you do not have the right to discriminate against people because they are gay or because they are trans.
So, Samantha, let me ask you this, and this is the thought experiment I use whenever I argue this case. Let's say the shoe is on the other foot. Let's say that you have a gay baker, and a customer comes in asking for a cake that says something homophobic. Or suppose someone wants to give a transgender person a cake with their dead name on it that says you're still a man just to be an asshole. Do you think that baker should be forced against their will to make cakes depicting those messages? Or how about this? Do you think you should be forced against your will to say homophobic or transphobic things on your show, Samantha? Obviously, she probably wouldn't. And that's sort of the problem with the mentality behind statism. My rights are important when they're convenient for me, but other people's rights are not important when they're not convenient for me. Samantha, if you want to expand the power of government to force homophobic people to say pro-gay things, how do you know that same government power isn't going to be turned around and be used to force you to say homophobic things? Statists always see themselves as the beneficiaries of the government powers they advocate for. They never imagine the possibility of it being turned against them. I believe that Jack Phillips has the right to refuse to make cakes with pro-gay messages for the same exact reason that I think Samantha has the right to refuse to say anti-gay messages on her channel.
These people are really out here complaining about an act called the Equality Act. They're like, no, not everybody's equal. No, not the transgenders.
Oh, you're against the Patriot Act, which expands the power of government to monitor us and invade our privacy? Huh, you must be unpatriotic. Literally the exact same logic. Look, I have no problem with transgender people. I think people have the right to live and identify however they want. But if you want to use government coercion to impose your beliefs and views about the world on everyone else, that's not acceptable. I'm all in favor of being more inclusive and accepting of trans people, but we don't need to expand government control over our lives to make that happen. This has been Philosophosa making stupidity play dead. Until next time, take care.